What's up, Wappers? Coming in here from Baltimore, the Charm City, just an hour north of D.C., where I'll be spending the evening. Tough loss today for your basis D.C. Red Giant basketball team, but thanks to a couple of the 8th graders who I saw at the game today, Chris Hickman, Kyle Wilson, Natalie Morrissey, Tasman, Anna, and I know I'm forgetting a few others, Mina, but if I do, Amelia. God, there's so many, I'm losing track of who was all there, but if I miss you, I apologize deeply, but my mind was on the 40-point loss we endured against a much better team. But regardless, let's talk history here. Let's talk WAP. And whether you're watching this tonight on Saturday or whether you're watching this on Super Bowl Sunday, remember, there is team trivia tomorrow. There is no quiz. So I'm going to lay the foundation for what this week we're going to be tackling, which is the Enlightenment Age in world history. We're now into that next sort of era of world history. In some respects, the Age of Discovery, Age of Exploration ended somewhat around the 1700s, 1750s. And so a lot of the topics we're talking about in the video tonight are late 1600s into the 1700s. So we're right on the fringe of the Age of Exploration giving way to the Age of Enlightenment. But in order to understand what the Enlightenment's all about, we really have to set the stage back in Europe, because the Enlightenment, like the Renaissance before it, and like the Scientific Revolution, those were three intellectual movements that started in Europe, and they would spread from Europe predominantly to the Americas and wherever the European colonies were all over the globe. The Enlightenment is a fundamentally important era in world history because it primarily deals with government. And the big question heading into the 1600s and 1700s from European monarchs' perspectives is, with this globalization occurring and colonization being spread from Europe to the Americas and all over, how much longer could these monarchs hold on to their power as their empires were growing? And so the reaction of most monarchies in Europe was to clamp down, to tighten their power grip on their colonies. We saw that with mercantilism. We saw that with some of the joint stock companies being taken over, like in India, for example. The British East India Company lost control of India to the British government. So you're dealing with a situation where kings and queens, in some cases, but mostly kings in Europe, really took power and grabbed it even more so than ever before. And so the term that I want to first introduce, the first term of the day, is absolutism. Anytime you see that term absolutism, you're dealing with the idea of absolute power, that the monarchy has all power. They're omnipotent. That means like all powerful. And while they did have centralized bureaucracies, where in some cases like Spain, they were split up into viceroyalties, the king is still, or the queen, is absolutely in power. Think Peter the Great. There was a guy who consolidated his power by taking power from the nobles. And in the end, Peter the Great is another example of someone who practiced absolutism. But I want to give you two examples of absolutism that are prime time for understanding what the Enlightenment is going to look to set up. And the two examples I'm going to go over here were two monarchs from the 1600s in England and France. Let's start with France first, because in France in the 1600s, you wound up with one of the most prime quintessential examples of an absolute ruler in the history of Europe, and that is Louis XIV. Louis XIV was from the House of Bourbon. That was the name of the royal French family that he came from, and he came to power in the 1600s. And during Louis XIV's reign, which he actually started at 5 years old, he took over as king as 5 years old. Now, he didn't rule until he was in his teens. The mother and the cardinal ruled France while Louis was coming into his own. But by the time he hit his late teens, Louis XIV restructured France and truly created an absolute monarchy in France. And France becomes the epitome of absolutism in the 1600s. And the best example of this show of strength for Louis and his absolutism is that he built a massive palace that was in the suburbs of modern-day France, and it's in the town of Versailles. And the Palace of Versailles is the quintessential example of absolutism. Now, the palace itself, if it was built today, would have cost billions, and it's one of the most glamorous, opulent, ostentatious palaces. In fact, it was so large that an elephant lived within the palace. And Louis XIV, like the entire French government, moved out of Paris as a result of Louis having this massive palace, which you're going to see images here. This massive palace was built far, far, far from Paris, which today may be about an hour or so train ride, but back in the day of horse and carriage, this would have taken much longer. The symbolism of the Palace of Versailles under Louis XIV was epic. Louis XIV considered himself an absolute ruler, so he builds this palace way out there from Paris, distant from the people, and the entire French government goes there, and this is where the idea of Louis XIV being, he called himself the Sun King, that he, sort of ruled everything in France, and Louis embodied the absolute ruler because not only did he build this massive gargantuan palace and move the government out of Paris, but that idea, that belief that you are the state, that you are the government, that you are France, right? That was something that Louis XIV fashioned, and that was something that really stuck France in a tough position because how do you continue the tradition? How do you break away from Louis XIV? And so the next French king after French king, they're going to have to keep up with the appearance of absolutism. Louis XIV sets a strong precedent for absolutism in his country. And major foreshadow, the Palace of Versailles, Louis XIV's rule, this is only going to intensify when the Enlightenment builds the tension between French citizens and the government. During the Enlightenment, we will come back to this week, France is going to be one of the countries that dives deepest into the Enlightenment, and much of that has to do with the fact that Louis XIV's rule as an absolute ruler, and then that passed down to Louis XV and ultimately Louis XVI, who were the next two French kings, and those two that followed Louis XIV had some big shoes and a big palace to fill, but nonetheless, France is a great example of absolutism. The other country that I want to focus on with absolutism is England, and the English. Remember, France had the absolutism down to a science under Louis XIV, but England was in a much different position as it started the 1600s. Because remember, you got to go back 400 years to the 1200s when English nobles forced the King John I, to sign the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta ultimately limited the power of the king by spreading power amongst the nobles. That would have had Peter the Great feeling very, very apprehensive, by the way. So Russia did not do anything like this. In fact, England was one of the only countries or monarchs that had somewhat of a shared relationship between the power of the nobles and the power of the absolute ruler. Now, as England progressed through its history and became a global power, it also switched to Protestantism thanks to Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth. But something else that becomes very important in the English government is the existence of a parliament. Now, the Magna Carta did not, I repeat, did not lead to the creation of Parliament, but Parliament, which was a legislative body of nobles, think like our modern-day Congress, similar but not the same. Nonetheless, England has a parliament where nobles had the ability to impact things in the English government such as wars and taxes. And so the king would have to sort of get clearance to declare war, and the king would seek counsel from Parliament if it was raising taxes. Those are two of the biggest issues that Parliament and the king kind of often went toe-to-toe on. Now, enter King Charles I, and Charles I was king of England in the early 1600s. What you need to know about Charles I is that almost right off the bat, there was tremendous tension between he and Parliament. Some of the tension was due to the fact that there was a well-represented rumor that Charles I was Catholic. And in a Protestant country, if the king is a secret Catholic, that creates disharmony. And there were rumors, and Parliament really didn't like the fact that Charles was perhaps a Catholic. And as a result of that, there was tension. And Charles was also barking up the wrong tree when it came to Parliament, because Charles decided that after so many conflicts with Parliament, taxes, wars, etc., Charles canceled and nullified the usage of Parliament. For almost 12 years, Charles I refused to really entertain the idea that Parliament would have any say in how he ran the government. And during this period, England's absolute monarchy explodes into something much bigger. And as a result of Charles I's rule, all of a sudden now England has wars it's fighting in Scotland, it's got wars it's fighting in England, Wales, even over in Ireland. And so all of a sudden there's turmoil galore in the English kingdom. So Parliament, who's sitting on the sidelines during all of this, there's so much tension between Parliament and Charles I that ultimately a civil war is going to erupt in England in the 1630s and 1640s. Charles's forces will be called the Loyalists. In fact, I have a good team trivia ready for tomorrow, so be ready for that one about the Loyalists. Meanwhile, Parliament's forces were led by a guy named Oliver Cromwell, who had served in Parliament. That's a name you need to know, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell served in Parliament, and he created what was called the New Model Army. And what was neat and interesting about the New Model Army is that Cromwell didn't allow titles and nobility to get in the way. He wanted the best soldiers to serve in the leadership of his New Model Army, which their nickname, by the way, was called the Roundheads because they had like kind of shaved, close crop haircuts. So it's the Roundheads versus the Loyalists, Parliament versus Charles I. And for about 6 or 7 years, England annihilates itself. We're talking hundreds of thousands of deaths. And the English Civil War didn't just stay in England. It also extended to their other colonies in outside of England, but mostly in Ireland, Scotland, and there's just carnage wreaking havoc across England. And England's one of the first European countries to go through a brutal and bloody civil war. Meanwhile, Europe was also war-torn. Keep in mind, this is the same time that the 30 Years' War was going on over in Germany involving Catholics and Protestants. So continuity throughout the 1600s is a war-torn Europe. But long story short, who wins the battle? Let's get to the juicy stuff. Parliament wins. It's a shocking upset. Parliament defeats King Charles's forces, and Oliver Cromwell is going to take over the English government. And Cromwell is going to run Parliament. I'll talk more about Cromwell after Team Trivia on Monday and why he ends up becoming even more unpopular in some ways than King Charles I. Cromwell does not get off to a great start as the head of the government in England, and ultimately the English, under Cromwell, will convict, after a trial, King Charles I of treason, and he will be headed to the chopping block. Yes, that's right, folks. This will be the first time in European history that any monarch was beheaded. And Charles I will have his beheading, and we'll talk about that story also on Monday. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. As we build towards the Age of Enlightenment, when European governments were changing and people were starting to question and talk about government and the best ways to rule, absolutism was the theme of the era right before the Enlightenment. So absolutism, countries believed in divine right and absolutism, and this is going to set up ultimately the breakthrough and the changes that came about, not just in England, but in France and all throughout Europe. And once again, Europe's going to be at the forefront of major change when it comes to world history, just like it was in the Age of Exploration. So I'll leave you with that. From Baltimore, it's Mr. Smith signing off. As always, Whappers, remember, the past shapes the future. Take care, Whappers, and have a great holiday. Oh, and I say holiday because, yes, I consider the Super Bowl a holiday. Here's the pick. It was on the best bets on the board. I'm going big with the Chiefs. I just have a feeling they're going to open up the offense. 34-16 Chiefs over 49ers. 34-16. I'm sending it in. We'll see you on Monday, folks. Take care. Bye.